The winter of 1967 was a brutal, unforgiving season in the Soviet interior. In a remote tracking station nestled in the shadows of the Ural Mountains, a facility so secret it was scrubbed from civilian postal routes, the air smelled of ozone, cheap tobacco, and the hum of vacuum tubes. This was the front line of the space race, where men in heavy wool coats sat in windowless rooms, listening to the static of the universe, waiting for a slip-up from the Americans or a triumph from their own. Among them was a young radio operator named Sergei. His world was defined by the rhythmic sweep of needles on dials and the hiss of short-wave noise. It was a tedious existence until the night of December 14th. As the wind howled against the reinforced concrete walls, Sergei's headphones captured something that shouldn't have been there. It wasn't the rhythmic beep-beep-beep of a standard beacon, nor was it the chaotic roar of solar winds. It was a weak, irregular pulse, a stuttering electronic whisper that barely crested over the noise floor of the receiver. Sergei leaned in, adjusting the fine-tuning knob with surgical precision. The signal was structured. It had a cadence, a mathematical sequence that repeated with haunting accuracy. He checked the frequency. His heart hammered against his ribs. That specific frequency belonged to a ghost. According to the thick, leather-bound manuals on his desk, stamped with the highest security clearances, the satellite designated to transmit on that band had been dead for over 3 years. It was a piece of space junk, a frozen husk of aluminum and glass tumbling through the vacuum. It had no batteries left. Its solar panels were pitted by micrometeoroids. Its internal circuitry had been baked by radiation and frozen by the shadow of the Earth. "Impossible," Sergei whispered. He checked the tracking arrays. The signal was coming from a high-inclination orbit, passing directly over the station's zenith. It was moving at 17,000 miles per hour, exactly where the dead satellite was projected to be. The problem wasn't just the sound. The problem was the implication. In the Soviet Union of 1967, things that were declared dead were supposed to stay dead. To suggest otherwise was to imply a failure of the state's engineering, or worse, that something else had taken control of their derelict technology. Sergei reached for the red telephone to alert his supervisor, unaware that he was tapping into a mystery that would outlive the Soviet Union itself. To understand the ghost signal, one must understand the era of the Cosmos program. During the height of the Cold War, the Soviet Union launched hundreds of satellites under the umbrella name Cosmos. It was a catch-all designation, a brilliant piece of maskirovka, military deception. If a satellite was a scientific triumph, it was given a heroic name. But if it was a spy satellite, a failed lunar probe, or a secret weapons platform, it was simply numbered and tossed into the Cosmos bin. Many were military, most were secret. Among them was Cosmos 127, a craft launched quietly from the Baikonur Cosmodrome under the shroud of a midnight blizzard. Cosmos 127 was designed for a short, violent burst of activity. Its mission was intelligence gathering, intercepting Western transmissions, and photographing NATO installations. It was built with the technology of the time: silver-zinc batteries with a hard expiration date, and primitive transistors that were never meant to survive the harsh environment of space for more than a few months. After 90 days, the mission was officially logged as a success. The final commands were sent to the craft to shut down its transmitters and begin its long, slow decay into the atmosphere. The Soviet Space Agency checked the box. The power should have failed. The electronics should have been bricked by the absolute zero of the cosmic shadow. The orbit should have turned into a lifeless, tumbling tombstone. It was declared dead by the Central Committee. In the eyes of the Kremlin, the satellite no longer existed. But space is not a graveyard that gives up its inhabitants easily. While the engineers in Moscow moved on to the next launch, Cosmos 127 continued its silent vigil. It was a zombie satellite, a piece of derelict hardware that refused to follow the script. The question that began to circulate among the few who knew of the signal was how? How does a machine with no power continue to speak? Some theorized a phantom charge, a rare chemical reaction in the depleted batteries that provided just enough voltage for a final dying breath. Others suggested the satellite's long antennas were acting as a cosmic bridge, picking up stray electromagnetic energy from the sun or the Earth's own ionosphere, effectively ghost-powering the ancient circuits. But the signal Sergei heard wasn't a dying breath. It was too steady. It was too purposeful. It was the sound of a machine that had found a second life in the dark. Years turned into decades. The Soviet Union struggled, stagnated, and eventually collapsed. The hidden tracking stations were abandoned, their windows smashed and their consoles stripped of copper. But the signal didn't care about the fall of empires. In the late 1970s and again in the mid-1980s, radio enthusiasts and Western intelligence agencies began picking up the stutter. It was no longer a secret confined to the Urals. The ghost of Cosmos had become a legend among the global community of satellite hunters, amateurs who spent their nights scanning the heavens for the voices of the Cold War. The signal returned, not once and not as a random burst of noise. It appeared with haunting regularity, always synchronized with the orbital path of the derelict Cosmos 127. When the signal was first detected by Western listeners, the initial reaction was skepticism. Engineers blamed atmospheric distortion. They pointed to solar noise, the sun's tendency to belch out radio interference that can mimic structured signals. They suggested it was a reflection, a signal from a modern station on Earth bouncing off the metal hull of the dead satellite and returning to ground, like a cosmic echo. But the data refused to fit the theories. Solar noise doesn't repeat a specific mathematical cadence. Atmospheric distortion doesn't follow a precise Keplerian orbit. The signal was coming from the craft. As the 20th century drew to a close, the mystery deepened. Analysis of the pulses suggested that the satellite wasn't just transmitting, it was attempting to handshake. It was sending out a telemetry request, as if it were still waiting for a command from a ground station that had been bulldozed 30 years prior. It was a digital hachiko, a loyal dog waiting at a train station for a master who was never coming home. The implications were chilling. If a primitive Soviet satellite could somehow self-resurrect and continue to function after decades of neglect, what did that mean for the thousands of other pieces of dead hardware orbiting above our heads? The signal returned, again and again. In the quiet hours of the night, if you had the right equipment and knew where to look in the sky, you could hear it, a faint, rhythmic scratching against the silence of the void. A satellite with no power, no mission, and no country was still transmitting. It was a reminder that in the cold, hard vacuum of space, some things never truly die. They just wait for someone to listen. In the sterile, fluorescent-lit halls of the Soviet Ministry of Defense, the ghost of Cosmos was more than a technical curiosity. To understand the gravity of the signal, one must peel back the layers of deception surrounding the Cosmos project and look at the specialized hardware buried inside the craft's lead-lined chassis. Cosmos 127 was not built to relay television broadcasts or photograph wheat fields. It was an object of the third class, a high-altitude early warning sensor. Its guts were packed with primitive but incredibly sensitive detectors designed to monitor the threshold of space for the specific violent signatures of a nuclear exchange. The satellite was equipped with 3 primary instruments. First, a bank of Geiger-Müller tubes, shielded to ignore the background radiation of the Van Allen belts, but calibrated to scream if they were hit by a burst of gamma radiation. Second, a high-frequency antenna designed to catch the click of an electromagnetic pulse, the sudden, atmosphere-stripping surge of energy that follows a high-altitude nuclear detonation. Third, a series of optical sensors designed to detect the unique double flash of a mushroom cloud reflecting off the ionosphere. Its purpose was simple, clinical, and terrifying. If the Cold War ever turned hot, Cosmos 127 was the tripwire. It would be the first to know that the missiles were in the air. Its job was to transmit a phase red signal back to the Kremlin, authorizing a retaliatory strike that would end civilization in less than an hour. This is why Sergei's discovery in 1967 sent such a cold shiver through the Soviet chain of command. If the satellite was officially dead, if its batteries were drained and its mission over, the only thing that should have been able to kickstart its transmitter was the detection of a nuclear event. The signal Sergei heard wasn't just noise, it was the specific modulation used for emergency telemetry. The ghost wasn't just talking, it was reporting. If the satellite was transmitting now, in a time of relative peace, the engineers were faced with a horrific binary choice. Either the electronics had suffered a catastrophic logic flip due to age and radiation, sending a false positive that could trigger a war, or the satellite was actually detecting something. It was catching whispers of electromagnetic disturbances that weren't on the maps. It was seeing flashes in the dark that no one else was looking for. What does a machine designed for the end of the world do when it finds itself in a world that hasn't ended yet? It searches for the fire. And as the 1960s bled into the 70s, the ghost continued to chirp its warning, a lonely sentinel crying wolf in the silence of the vacuum. Inside the Kremlin, the ghost was treated like a ticking bomb. No alarms were raised publicly. The Soviet citizen went to work, stood in bread lines, and watched state-approved films, entirely unaware that their government was locked in a silent struggle with a piece of its own abandoned technology. Behind closed doors, the panic was palpable. General Secretary Leonid Brezhnev was reportedly briefed on the irregular telemetry of Object 127. The concern wasn't just about the signal itself, but the stability of the Soviet command and control structure. The Soviet system was built on rigid protocols. If an early warning satellite, even an old, decommissioned one, started broadcasting phase red data, the automated systems at the missile silos might interpret it as a valid command. Specialists from the OKB-1 Design Bureau were summoned to a secure facility in the outskirts of Moscow. They were given a week to explain how a dead satellite could be transmitting. They pored over the original blueprints, looking for a flaw, a capacitor that might have held a charge for 3 years, or a wiring short that could bypass the power switch. They found nothing. The panic shifted from a technical glitch to a geopolitical nightmare. If the satellite wasn't malfunctioning, some analysts feared it was detecting secret American nuclear tests. In the 1960s, the United States was suspected of experimenting with clean nuclear devices in deep space, beyond the reach of standard detection. If Cosmos 127 was catching the gamma-ray backscatter from these tests, the USSR was effectively blind to a new American weapon. Others feared something even more existential, a machine acting without human control. In the early days of computer science, the idea of emergent behavior, where a system begins to act in ways its creators didn't intend, was a ghost story whispered by mathematicians. Could the harsh environment of space have annealed the satellite's primitive circuits? Could the constant bombardment of cosmic rays have rewritten the magnetic memory of the craft, turning it into a semi-autonomous entity that refused to shut down? To the Soviet mind, a machine that didn't obey orders was a threat to the state. Orders were given to blind the satellite, to use high-powered ground-based lasers to fry its sensors as it passed overhead. But the satellite was a small target, moving at orbital velocities, and the technology of the time wasn't precise enough. The ghost continued to fly. It continued to watch, and every time it passed over a Soviet tracking station, it whispered the same terrifying question: "Are you ready for the end?"
The Iron Curtain was not thick enough to stop a radio wave. Across the Atlantic, at the National Security Agency's listening post at Fort Meade and at remote listening farms in the Aleutian Islands, the Americans were also tuning in. They had been tracking Cosmos 127 since the day it launched. They had seen it die on their radar screens in 1964, and they had seen it wake up in 1967. They didn't call it a ghost, they called it Anomaly 127. Independent listening stations, amateur ham radio operators who spent their nights mapping the radio sky, began to pick up the transmission as well. They noticed the crude signal structure, the old-fashioned modulation that screamed Soviet 1950s technology. It was a clunky, heavy-handed signal, like a telegraph being tapped out in a digital age. The CIA and the NSA were initially convinced it was a Soviet trick, a honeypot signal designed to lure American intelligence into revealing their own sensitive listening posts. They waited for the Soviets to acknowledge the satellite. They waited for a press release about a new scientific breakthrough. The silence from Moscow was the loudest part of the signal. For the first time in history, both superpowers were listening to the same ghost, and neither knew what to do with it. The Americans feared it was a weapon, the Soviets feared it was a witness. In the high stakes of nuclear brinksmanship, transparency was usually a virtue. You wanted your enemy to know you were strong, but this was different. This was a shared secret that neither side could explain. The ghost had become a neutral observer in a world divided by ideology. It sat 200 miles above the clouds, a derelict piece of scrap metal that was still keeping a heartbeat. The signal was a bridge. It forced scientists on both sides of the curtain to look at the same data. They saw the same spikes in gamma detection, the same weird EMP clicks that didn't correspond to any known bomb tests. They began to realize that the ghost wasn't just detecting the weapons of men, it was detecting the fundamental instability of the universe itself. It was picking up the breathing of the sun, the ripple of gravitational waves, and the echoes of distant stars, things its creators never intended it to see. The satellite outlived its masters, its mission, and its country. It had transitioned from a weapon of war into a lonely observer of the cosmos, still sending its crude, stuttering reports back to a world that was too afraid to answer. As the decade turned and the ghost refused to fade, the Soviet Engineering Corps was forced to look inward. At a high-security design bureau in Samara, a team of veteran aerospace engineers, men who had worked under the legendary Sergei Korolev, were tasked with a post-mortem reconstruction of a satellite that refused to stay dead. They pulled the dusty, blue-inked blueprints of the Cosmos series from the archives, trying to understand how a machine designed for a 90-day lifespan was still screaming after 1,000 days in the void. What they found was a triumph of accidental immortality.
In the early 1960s, Soviet manufacturing was characterized by a specific kind of brute force engineering. Because their transistors were less efficient and more prone to failure than Western components, they overbuilt everything. Cosmos 127 was a fortress in miniature. To protect its sensitive early warning sensors from the very nuclear radiation it was meant to detect, the engineers had wrapped its core in heavy lead shielding and thick aluminum plating. Furthermore, to ensure the transmitter could blast a high-gain signal through the interference of a nuclear ionized atmosphere, they had installed massive oversized capacitors. These were the drums of the electrical system, designed to store huge amounts of energy and release it in a single violent burst. Ironically, the very features designed for a short, intense mission were what allowed the ghost to haunt the heavens. The engineers began to realize that the satellite wasn't functioning in the traditional sense. It wasn't running a program. Instead, it was experiencing a form of mechanical reanimation driven by the violent environment of low Earth orbit. The satellite was being subjected to thermal cycling, the brutal swinging of temperatures from 250 degrees Fahrenheit in direct sunlight to negative 250 degrees Fahrenheit in the Earth's shadow. This constant expansion and contraction of the metal hull acted like a slow, rhythmic pump. As the satellite tumbled, its long, spindly antenna swept through the Earth's magnetic field, generating tiny, infinitesimal currents of static electricity through electromagnetic induction. In a modern satellite, this would be negligible noise, but in the overbuilt, shielded guts of Cosmos 127, those tiny trickles of power were being caught by those massive dormant capacitors. Over weeks and months, the drums would fill, drop by drop, with the background energy of the universe. When the voltage reached a certain critical threshold, a degraded relay, half fused by radiation, would snap shut. The capacitors would dump their load into the aging transmitter, and for a few brief minutes, the satellite would twitch. It wasn't a heartbeat, it was a muscle spasm. The ghost was a digital corpse being struck by cosmic lightning, jerking into a semblance of life every time its ancient lungs filled with enough solar static to scream. This realization, however, brought no comfort to the men in Moscow. A machine that twitches is far more unpredictable than a machine that thinks. By the mid-1970s, the ghost had been tracked for nearly a decade. The datasets were now large enough for computer analysts at the Soviet Academy of Sciences to begin looking for a deeper rhythm. They fed the signal timestamps into primitive mainframes, cross-referencing them against every known variable in the solar system. A pattern emerged, and it was a pattern that no one liked. The signal didn't appear at random intervals, it spiked. The twitching of Cosmos 127 became more frequent and more intense during specific astronomical windows, solar flares, geomagnetic storms, and high-intensity cosmic radiation events. When the sun belched 1 billion tons of ionized gas into space, the ghost would go into a frenzy. Its transmission rate would triple. The signal structure, normally a rhythmic stutter, would become frantic and jagged. To the analysts, the conclusion was inescapable. The satellite wasn't sending data it had collected, it was reacting to the environment in real time. The early warning sensors, designed to detect the birth of a nuclear war, were confusing the violent weather of the sun for the end of the world. Every time a solar flare hit the satellite's sensors, the ancient logic gates, already frayed by years of vacuum exposure, would fire. The machine was doing exactly what it was programmed to do in 1962. It was sounding the alarm. It was a reflex as deep and instinctual as a human flinching from a hot flame. But a reflex at the edge of space has consequences on the ground. The analysts noticed that the ghost seemed to be screaming at the sun, but its voice was tuned to the frequencies used by the Soviet Union's most sensitive defense networks. It was as if a ghost were standing in the middle of a modern battlefield, screaming "Fire!" every time it saw a sunset. The fear shifted from a technical error to a biological one. The machine was alive in the sense that it was interacting with its environment, but it lacked the one thing that keeps the world safe: judgment. It couldn't tell the difference between a solar storm and a NATO strike, and in a hair-trigger environment of the Cold War, where decisions had to be made in minutes, the reflexes of a dead satellite were a recipe for a catastrophe that no one could stop once it began. As the 1980s dawned, a new and more terrifying realization began to circulate among the elite circles of Soviet and American intelligence. This was the fear that everyone kept quiet, the one that didn't make it into the official reports because it suggested a level of vulnerability that was too high to admit. The true nightmare wasn't just that the satellite was detecting things it shouldn't. The nightmare was misinterpretation.
Both the United States and the Soviet Union had spent 20 years building automatic response systems, vast computerized networks designed to take the human element out of the nuclear loop to ensure speed. These systems, like the Soviet perimeter, later known as dead hand, were designed to listen for specific signals. They were programmed to recognize the phase red telemetry of satellites just like Cosmos 127. The terrifying question was, what if an outdated, forgotten system somewhere in the depths of a
In the early 1960s, Soviet manufacturing was characterized by a specific kind of brute force engineering. Because their transistors were less efficient and more prone to failure than Western components, they overbuilt everything. Cosmos 127 was a fortress in miniature. To protect its sensitive early warning sensors from the very nuclear radiation it was meant to detect, the engineers had wrapped its core in heavy lead shielding and thick aluminum plating. Furthermore, to ensure the transmitter could blast a high-gain signal through the interference of a nuclear ionized atmosphere, they had installed massive oversized capacitors. These were the drums of the electrical system, designed to store huge amounts of energy and release it in a single violent burst. Ironically, the very features designed for a short, intense mission were what allowed the ghost to haunt the heavens. The engineers began to realize that the satellite wasn't functioning in the traditional sense. It wasn't running a program. Instead, it was experiencing a form of mechanical reanimation driven by the violent environment of low Earth orbit. The satellite was being subjected to thermal cycling, the brutal swinging of temperatures from 250 degrees Fahrenheit in direct sunlight to negative 250 degrees Fahrenheit in the Earth's shadow. This constant expansion and contraction of the metal hull acted like a slow, rhythmic pump. As the satellite tumbled, its long, spindly antenna swept through the Earth's magnetic field, generating tiny, infinitesimal currents of static electricity through electromagnetic induction. In a modern satellite, this would be negligible noise, but in the overbuilt, shielded guts of Cosmos 127, those tiny trickles of power were being caught by those massive dormant capacitors. Over weeks and months, the drums would fill, drop by drop, with the background energy of the universe. When the voltage reached a certain critical threshold, a degraded relay, half fused by radiation, would snap shut. The capacitors would dump their load into the aging transmitter, and for a few brief minutes, the satellite would twitch. It wasn't a heartbeat, it was a muscle spasm. The ghost was a digital corpse being struck by cosmic lightning, jerking into a semblance of life every time its ancient lungs filled with enough solar static to scream. This realization, however, brought no comfort to the men in Moscow. A machine that twitches is far more unpredictable than a machine that thinks. By the mid-1970s, the ghost had been tracked for nearly a decade. The datasets were now large enough for computer analysts at the Soviet Academy of Sciences to begin looking for a deeper rhythm. They fed the signal timestamps into primitive mainframes, cross-referencing them against every known variable in the solar system. A pattern emerged, and it was a pattern that no one liked. The signal didn't appear at random intervals, it spiked. The twitching of Cosmos 127 became more frequent and more intense during specific astronomical windows, solar flares, geomagnetic storms, and high-intensity cosmic radiation events. When the sun belched 1 billion tons of ionized gas into space, the ghost would go into a frenzy. Its transmission rate would triple. The signal structure, normally a rhythmic stutter, would become frantic and jagged. To the analysts, the conclusion was inescapable. The satellite wasn't sending data it had collected, it was reacting to the environment in real time. The early warning sensors, designed to detect the birth of a nuclear war, were confusing the violent weather of the sun for the end of the world. Every time a solar flare hit the satellite's sensors, the ancient logic gates, already frayed by years of